A thin trail of blood crossed the snow beside a frozen Idaho lake. Elias Rowan followed it, expecting a wounded animal, but found a mother German shepherd carrying her pup through the cold. She did not ask for help. She stood there trembling, ready to spend her last breath protecting one tiny life. Elias brought her home, never knowing that this broken mother dog remembered a path the whole town had tried to forget. Behind Brightwater's pretty winter streets, old fear had buried the truth about water, land, and the people who had stayed silent too long. And sometimes God does not send a miracle with thunder. Sometimes he sends it through muddy paws, a torn ear, and a mother who refuses to give up. If this story touches your heart, tell us where you're watching from. Leave your thoughts below, and please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep writing more meaningful stories. Before writing, I checked the chapter's rhythm for repetition. The main risk was making the opening feel like another familiar, lonely veteran finds wounded dog in snow scene. To avoid that, this chapter leans less on shock and more on restraint. Elias does not rescue Mara by force, and Mara does not immediately trust him. The emotional center is not heroism, but the slow negotiation between two wounded creatures who both understand survival. Elias Rowan had learned that winter could make even a small life feel enormous. His cabin stood on the northern edge of Brightwater, Idaho, where the pine forest bent toward a frozen lake and the mountains rose behind it like old gray guardians. Snow covered the roof in soft white layers. Smoke curled from the chimney most mornings. From a distance, the place looked peaceful enough to belong on a postcard, sold in the town bakery beside jars of huckleberry jam. Inside, it was quieter than peace. It was the silence of a man who had built walls without meaning to. Elias was 52 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of strength that had settled into his bones rather than shown itself off. His hands were large, scarred, and rough from years of weapons, ropes, boat engines, frozen tools, and stubborn bolts that refused to loosen unless a man spoke to them with both patience and profanity. He had once been a Navy SEAL. Now he repaired winter boats, cleared snow from the driveways of older residents, fixed broken generators, and accepted payment in cash, coffee, firewood, or once, a lemon pie from Ruth Calder at the bakery. The pie had been too sweet, but Elias had eaten every bite because refusing kindness felt ruder than surviving it. Most days he wore an old combat shirt beneath his jacket, olive drab across the torso, camouflage sleeves, faint horizontal bands around the upper arms. The shirt had outlived its official purpose. It no longer belonged to missions or briefings or places no one in Brightwater asked about. Now it smelled of pine smoke, motor oil, and cold air. His dark hair, threaded with silver, had grown longer than military habit would have approved. It sat unevenly beneath his gray wool cap. A short salt and pepper stubble shadowed his jaw. His nose had been broken once and had never quite forgiven him. His eyes were dark amber brown, watchful but not sharp in a cruel way. They belonged to a man who looked at the world as if every quiet thing might suddenly need protecting. That morning, he was driving along the road beside the frozen lake, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the brass compass in his jacket pocket. The compass was old, dented, and nearly useless in modern life. Elias carried it anyway. Some men carried photographs, some carried medals. Elias carried a small broken promise to always find his way back. Snow fell lightly, not in a storm, but in slow, thoughtful flakes. The world looked newly made. Pine branches wore white sleeves. The lake shone pale beneath the clouded sky. Even the tire tracks ahead seemed gentle, as though the earth had decided to forgive every vehicle that crossed it. Then Elias saw the red line. At first, it was no more than a thin mark drawn across the snow near the edge of the road. He eased off the gas. The truck rolled forward another few yards. There it was again, broken and faint, then darker near the ditch. Blood. Elias stopped. For a moment he did not move. Old training rose quietly in him, not as panic, but as order. Observe first, Act second. Do not rush into what you do not understand. He stepped out of the truck. The cold reached for his face immediately, needling the skin across his cheeks. His boots sank into fresh snow. He listened. The forest gave him the usual winter sounds, a branch creaking under weight, wind moving through needles, the distant groan of lake ice shifting beneath itself. Then came something else. A low sound, not a howl, not a bark, a warning. Elias turned toward the pines. Between two snow-heavy trunks stood a German shepherd. She was thin enough that winter seemed to have carved her down to bone and will. Black and tan fur clung wetly to her frame. Her back was dark, almost like a burned cloak thrown over her shoulders, while her chest and legs carried a dull honey color, muted by frost and dirt. One shoulder was stained red. Her left ear was torn at the edge and tilted slightly when she moved, but it was her mouth that held Elias still. She was carrying a puppy. The little one hung carefully between her jaws, not limp, but weak, its small body trembling against the cold. A soft whimper escaped it, no louder than the squeak of a hinge in an empty church. The mother dog's eyes locked on Elias. Amber, bright, terrified, furious. She growled again, the sound low and broken, less a threat than a final law carved into the snow. Come closer, and I will spend the last of myself stopping you. Elias lifted both hands slowly. All right, he said, his voice low. I see you. The dog did not move. He had seen that look before, though never in a dog's face. He had seen it in men pulled from ruined buildings, in civilians crouched behind broken walls, in soldiers who had learned that rescue sometimes arrived wearing the same shape as danger. Fear could make a creature savage. Pain could make it holy. Elias took one step back. The mother dog's growl softened, but her eyes did not. He returned to the truck and opened the passenger door. In the glove compartment, he kept a paper-wrapped sandwich from Ruth's Bakery, bought 2 hours earlier and forgotten after a generator repair call. Turkey, cheddar, too much mustard. Not the grand feast of kings, but for a starving animal, maybe close enough to a miracle. He tore away the bread and meat, crouched, and placed it on the snow halfway between them. Then he backed away. The dog stared at the food. The puppy made that small sound again. Something changed in the mother's face. Not trust. Trust was too expensive. Hunger moved first. Need followed. Still holding the puppy, she stepped forward. One paw, then another. Her injured shoulder dipped. She nearly stumbled, recovered, and froze, glaring at Elias as if daring him to notice her weakness. I'm not laughing, Elias murmured. The absurdity of saying that to a dog might have made another man smile. Elias did not. The forest felt too solemn for jokes, as if the old pines had gathered to witness a treaty between two exhausted nations. The mother set the puppy down between her front paws just long enough to snatch a piece of turkey. She swallowed too fast, coughed, then stood over the puppy again. Elias saw the puppy clearly now. Tiny, damp, mostly tan, with a dark smudge on its forehead like a thumbprint of soot. One front paw was lighter than the others. Its eyes were barely open. It nosed weakly toward its mother's belly, but she was shaking too hard to settle. Elias felt something open in his chest, and with it came an old sound from far away. Not gunfire, not explosions. A voice, weak, human, calling from dust. He blinked, and the forest returned. The dog watched him as if she had seen the memory pass across his face. Elias slowly removed his jacket. Beneath it, the olive combat shirt clung close to his frame, its camouflage sleeves darkened at the cuffs. The cold bit through the fabric immediately. He laid the jacket on the snow, lining side up, then stepped back again. The dog did not understand the gesture at first, or perhaps she understood too much and trusted none of it. Elias waited. Snow gathered on his shoulders. Cold seeped through his boots. The sandwich lay half-eaten, already stiffening in the air. The puppy whimpered once more, and the mother lowered her muzzle to touch it. There was a tenderness in that movement so fierce it almost hurt to witness. Elias spoke again, not because words would save her, but because silence sometimes sounded too much like a trap. "You don't have to like me," he said. "You just have to live." The mother dog looked toward the jacket, then toward the road, then back at Elias. He could almost see the terrible arithmetic inside her, the woods behind her, the stranger before her, the cold below her, the puppy beneath her chin. No safe answer, only the least deadly one. Finally, she picked up the puppy and stepped onto the jacket. Not surrender. Never that. A mother's compromise. Elias exhaled slowly. He moved with painful care, sliding one hand under the jacket without touching her first. She growled so sharply his fingers stopped in place. "Fair," he whispered. He waited again. The dog's legs trembled. Her eyes remained fixed on his face. Then, inch by inch, Elias lifted the jacket like a stretcher, puppy and mother together. The dog's body went rigid, but she did not bite. He carried them to the truck bed, where an old wool blanket lay folded beside a toolbox and 2 coils of paracord. He made a nest between the wheel well and the cab, shielded from wind. The mother stumbled once as he set her down, then curled around the puppy with a speed that was almost violent. Elias closed the tailgate halfway, securing it with a short rope so she would not feel trapped in darkness. Only then did he climb into the driver's seat. His hands were shaking. He gripped the wheel until they stopped. "Not today," he said softly, though he was not sure if he meant the cold, the past, or death itself. The drive back to the cabin took 12 minutes. Elias drove as if carrying glass. Every bump in the road made him glance at the rearview mirror. Once he saw the mother dog lift her head, ears uneven, eyes fixed on him through the back window. She looked less like an animal being rescued than a queen being carried through enemy lands after the fall of her city. At the cabin, Elias left the truck running for heat while he prepared the mudroom. He spread blankets near the stove, filled a shallow bowl with water, warmed a little broth, and called Dr. June Harlan. June answered on the 4th ring. "If this is about that Perkins snowblower again," she said, "tell him it is not possessed. It is neglected." "It's not Perkins," Elias said. The humor disappeared from her voice. "Animal or person?" "Dog, German Shepherd, injured, has a puppy." A pause. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm calling you." "I'm on my way." June Harlan arrived 23 minutes later in a navy parka, boots crusted with snow, a leather medical bag in one hand. She was in her mid-50s, lean, sharp-eyed, with silver threaded through brown hair pulled low at the back of her neck. She had the calm of someone who had stitched wounds while being bitten, kicked, cursed at, and thanked in languages without words. She did not rush toward the dog. Smart woman, Elias thought. The mother dog raised her head from the blankets and growled. The puppy was tucked beneath her chin, no longer crying, only shivering in little fading waves. June crouched several feet away. "Well," she said gently, "you look like you've had a worse morning than I have." The dog stared. June glanced at Elias. "Name?" "Doesn't have one." "She will." It took time. Everything that mattered did. June examined the dog slowly, using patience like a second pair of hands. She found bruising beneath the fur, old marks on the neck where a tight collar or chain had rubbed too long. The shoulder wound was fresh but not fatal. The ribs told their own story. So did the way the dog flinched when June lifted a hand too quickly. June's mouth tightened, but her voice stayed even. This wasn't just the storm. Elias stood near the doorway, arms folded, jaw still. "No," he said. "She's been hit, underfed, probably confined." June looked toward the puppy, and she still carried him through the snow. The cabin went quiet except for the stove and the small wet breathing of the puppy. Elias looked at the mother dog. She watched him back, exhausted but unbroken, her torn left ear tilted as if listening for the next betrayal. "What do we call her?" June asked. Elias did not answer right away. Names were dangerous. A name meant you had let something cross the border between problem and responsibility, between stranger and kin. The dog lowered her muzzle and nudged the puppy closer to her belly. "Mara?" Elias said. June looked at him. "Means bitter, doesn't it?" she asked. "Maybe," Elias replied, "but she doesn't look finished." June gave the smallest smile. "Mara it is." The puppy sneezed, so tiny and offended by the world that June huffed a laugh despite herself. "And him?" Elias watched the little soot-marked head wobble blindly against his mother's fur. "Pip?" June nodded. "Pip has opinions. He's small. Small things often do." For the first time that day, Elias almost smiled. By evening, June had cleaned Mara's wound, treated both dogs for exposure, and left Elias with instructions written in stern block letters. Warmth, water, small meals, no sudden movements. Call if breathing changes. Call if bleeding returns. Call if the mother stops responding. Then she stood at the door and looked back. "Elias," she said quietly, "whoever had her before may come looking." He kept his eyes on Mara. "I know." June studied him a moment, perhaps hearing the old steel beneath the simple words. "Don't make it a war unless it has to be." He nodded. But after she left and the cabin settled into the blue hush of winter evening, Elias knew some wars did not begin with gunfire. Some began with a mother carrying her child through snow. Night came slowly over Brightwater. The lake turned black beneath its skin of ice. The pines disappeared into shadow. Inside the cabin, firelight moved across the log walls and softened everything it touched. The worn boots by the door, the old compass on the table, the coils of green paracord, the combat shirt drying near the stove, the man sitting silently in a chair with his elbows on his knees. Mara lay near the hearth, her body curved around Pip. She did not sleep deeply. Each time Elias shifted, one amber eye opened. Each time the wind pressed against the window, her ears lifted. But she no longer growled. That was not trust. Not yet. It was simply the first inch of a bridge. Pip finally stopped trembling. The puppy pressed his small body into his mother's warmth and made a soft, satisfied sound that seemed far too gentle for the world that had nearly taken him. Elias leaned back in the chair. For years, his cabin had been a shelter from memory, a place where he could keep the world at a distance and call it peace. But that night, with a wounded mother guarding her pup beside the fire, the room felt different, not safer, more alive. And life, Elias knew, was never quiet for long. Still, he stayed there until the fire burned low, watching Mara breathe, watching Pip sleep, feeling the old emptiness inside the cabin make room for something small, fragile, and stubborn enough to survive. By midnight, the snow outside had covered the blood trail completely. But Elias remembered where it had been. And so did Mara. For 3 days, the cabin learned how to breathe differently. The first night had been all vigilance. Mara slept with one eye half open, her torn left ear twitching at every groan of the wood stove, every scrape of snow slipping from the roof. Pip stayed tucked beneath her chin, a tiny patch of warmth against a world that had nearly frozen him before he had learned what the world was. By the second day, the puppy's trembling had eased. By the third, he had discovered that his own paws existed. He did not yet know what to do with them. He nudged one, startled himself, then sneezed as if offended by creation. Elias, sitting at the kitchen table with a manual for an old water pump spread open before him, watched the puppy wobble into the blanket fold and vanish nose first. Mara lifted her head sharply. "He's fine," Elias said. Mara stared at him. The stare said, "You do not know that." Elias nodded once. Fair point. He had begun speaking to her like that, not as if she were a pet, not yet, but as if she were a difficult neighbor with strong opinions about borders. He did not touch Pip unless June was there. He did not step over Mara. He did not reach down from above. When he brought food, he placed the bowl near the edge of the blanket and backed away. Trust, he had learned, was not built by grand gestures. It was built by doing the same harmless thing over and over until the wounded stopped expecting the knife hidden inside it. That afternoon, snowlight filled the cabin in a pale blue wash. Elias wore his olive combat shirt, the camouflage sleeves pushed to his forearms while he tightened a loose hinge on the mudroom door. Outside, the lake lay frozen and bright beyond the trees. The cabin smelled of broth, pine smoke, machine oil, and the faint medicinal sharpness June had left behind. Mara still would not let him touch her. But she had stopped growling when he entered the room. For Elias, that felt like being granted citizenship in a very small, very suspicious kingdom. He carried his mug of coffee to the stove and opened the pump manual again. The book was old, full of diagrams that looked as if they had been drawn by someone who personally hated farmers. He read aloud because the silence in the cabin had become too alive to ignore. Step 4, he said, remove the intake housing. That sounds simple, which means some engineer is laughing in a warm office somewhere. Pip from the blanket made a soft squeaking sound. Elias glanced down. You agree. Mara's ears shifted, not relaxed, never that, but not entirely hostile either. It was enough. Then a truck turned into the drive. Elias heard it before Mara did, only because he had been listening for the snowplow all morning. The engine came up the road too fast, tires grinding over packed ice, then fishtailing slightly before stopping outside with a rough cough. Mara rose so quickly the water bowl tipped beside her. Pip whimpered. Elias set the coffee down. Through the front window, he saw a rusted pickup sitting crooked in the yard. Its driver's door opened with a metallic screech. A man climbed out, tall but poorly held together, as if anger and liquor were the only ropes keeping his bones upright. He wore a cracked black jacket, dirty jeans, and boots that dragged snow and mud in equal measure. A dark beanie sat low over greasy blonde-gray hair. Even from inside, Elias could see the ring of keys hanging from the man's belt. They swung and clattered as he walked. Mara made a sound Elias had not heard from her before. Not just a growl, a memory given teeth. The man banged on the door without knocking properly. "Open up!" Elias moved slowly, not because he was afraid, but because speed would feed the wrong fire. He picked up his phone, slipped it into his back pocket, and opened the door just wide enough to stand in it. Cold air rushed into the cabin. The man's face was red from wind and drink. Broken veins marked his nose. His eyes were gray and wet-looking, but there was calculation under the haze. "You Rowan?" he demanded. Elias did not answer immediately. He let the silence become uncomfortable. The man sniffed hard. "I'm Garrick Vale. That dog in there is mine." Behind Elias, Mara's growl deepened. Garrick's eyes flicked past him into the cabin. The moment he saw her, his mouth twisted, not with relief, not with concern, but possession. "There she is," he said. "Roxy." Mara moved in front of Pip so fast the puppy disappeared behind her legs. Elias shifted his weight, blocking more of the doorway. "Her name is Mara." Garrick gave a laugh that had no humor in it. "You rename my property now?" She was found injured in the snow. Dogs run off. Dogs get hurt. Garrick pulled a folded stack of papers from inside his jacket and slapped them against his palm. "I got papers. Bought her from a breeder down near Spokane. She's mine." He tried to step forward. Elias did not move aside. The difference between them became clear in that small moment. Garrick leaned into the doorway like a man used to people backing up. Elias stood like something the mountain had placed there before either of them was born. "You're not coming in," Elias said. Garrick's jaw tightened. "You some kind of animal saint?" "No." "You one of those military guys thinks he can take what he wants?" Elias felt the sentence strike a place it was meant to strike. Men like Garrick were not always smart, but cruelty had its own kind of instinct. It sniffed out old wounds and pressed a thumb into them. Mara barked once. It was sharp, violent, full of terror held on a chain. Garrick flinched, then turned his embarrassment into anger. "Shut up, Roxy!" Mara lowered her head, teeth bare. Elias saw her body change, the injured shoulder tucked inward, her back legs braced. She was not preparing to attack for herself. She was placing her body between Garrick and Pip. The cabin seemed to shrink around that truth. Whatever those papers said, they did not say enough. Elias took out his phone and called June. Garrick laughed. "Calling your girlfriend?" "Veterinarian." "I don't need a vet. I need my dog." Elias made a second call after June answered, this one to Sheriff Dale Mercer. By the time June's old SUV pulled into the drive, Garrick had started pacing in the snow, muttering to himself, keys clattering with every turn. June stepped out in a navy parka, her medical bag in hand, though Elias had told her this was not a treatment call. Her face, usually practical and composed, hardened when she saw Garrick. "You," she said. Garrick pointed at her. "Don't start." June walked past him without asking permission and stood beside Elias at the door. "Mara still inside?" "Yes." "Puppy?" "Behind her." Garrick snorted. "Puppy's mine, too." June's eyes cut toward him. "That your official statement?" "Damn right." "Good," she said. "Say it clearly when the sheriff gets here." For the first time, uncertainty moved across Garrick's face. Sheriff Dale Mercer arrived 10 minutes later in a Brown County vehicle with salt crusted along the sides. Dale was a thick-built man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the tired eyes of someone who had spent too many years deciding which troubles were worth making worse. He stepped out slowly, adjusted the brim of his hat, and looked from Elias to Garrick to June. "What's going on?" Garrick raised his papers. "He stole my dog." June folded her arms. The dog was found injured, underfed, and carrying a hypothermic puppy through the snow. "Allegedly," Garrick said. June turned her whole body toward him. "Try that word again." Dale lifted a hand. "Let's keep this civil." Elias watched the sheriff carefully. Dale did not look corrupt in the dramatic way men did in bad movies. He looked uncomfortable. Worse, he looked practiced at being uncomfortable and doing nothing with it. Dale glanced through the doorway. Mara growled the moment she saw Garrick near the opening. The sheriff heard it, saw the dog's posture, saw the puppy hidden behind her. Then he looked away. "This may be a property dispute," Dale said. June stared at him. "That is not all this is. I'm saying what I can prove today." Garrick smiled. There it was, Elias thought. Not victory, familiarity. Garrick had known what the sheriff would say before Dale said it. Elias felt something cold settle in him. Not rage. Rage was too hot, too easy, too wasteful. This was calculation. He looked at Mara. Her ribs showed beneath her fur. Her torn ear trembled. Still she stood. He thought of the brass compass in his jacket pocket, of all the times he had carried it without knowing whether it mocked him or guided him. He had spent years telling himself he wanted no more fights, no more causes, no more lines in the sand. But there, in his doorway, a line had appeared anyway. Small, fur-covered, shaking, guarding her child. Elias reached into his pocket, took out the compass, and laid it on the small table just inside the door. The old metal caught the winter light. For a strange second, everyone looked at it. Then Elias said, "How much?" Garrick blinked. "What?" "How much to sign them over, the mother and the pup, permanently?" June turned toward him. "Elias." He did not look away from Garrick. "Legal transfer, written, witnessed, on video." Garrick's suspicion returned. "Why?" "Because I don't want ambiguity." "Big word for dog theft." "How much?" Garrick's eyes narrowed. Men like him understood greed more easily than mercy. Mercy confused them. Money made the room familiar again. He named a number that was absurd for a wounded, underfed dog and a half-frozen puppy. June swore under her breath. Dale looked down at the snow. Elias did not react. He had known the number might hurt. He hadn't known it would feel like cutting loose the last rope to a life he had already lost. In his desk drawer sat the envelope from selling his old motorcycle, a black Triumph he had kept under a tarp in the shed for years. He had told himself he would ride it again someday when his hands stopped shaking at sudden sounds. But someday was a country many men died trying to reach. He went inside, leaving the door open, but keeping his body between Garrick and Mara. He retrieved the envelope, counted the cash at the kitchen table, then added nearly all that remained from the small emergency fund he kept in a tin beneath the sink. When he returned, June's expression had softened into something almost sad. "Elias," she said quietly, "you don't have to buy decency from him." "No," Elias replied, "I'm buying proof." They wrote the agreement on the hood of Dale's patrol vehicle because Garrick refused to enter the cabin and Elias refused to let him. June provided exact wording. Dale, trapped now by his own presence, wrote his name as witness. Elias recorded everything on his phone: Garrick's face, the papers, the money, the signed transfer of ownership for the dog formerly called Roxy, and her puppy. Garrick's hand shook when he took the cash, but not from shame. Before climbing into his truck, he leaned close enough that Elias smelled sour whiskey and old smoke. "You think you won something," Garrick said, "but you just bought yourself a problem with teeth." Elias held his gaze. "Then I got the better end of the deal." Garrick's smile flickered. For a moment, Elias saw what lived under the man's bluster. Not power, fear. Garrick was afraid of someone or something bigger than himself. Then he climbed into the rusted truck, slammed the door, and tore out of the drive, spraying dirty snow behind him. The sound of his engine faded into the trees. No one spoke right away. Dale removed his hat, rubbed the back of his neck, and looked toward the cabin. "I'll file the note." June's voice was flat. "Will you?" The sheriff flinched at that more than he had at Garrick's yelling. "I said I will." Elias picked up the signed paper from the hood and folded it carefully. Dale glanced at him. "You should be careful." "Is that advice?" Elias asked, "or warning?" The sheriff did not answer. He got into his vehicle and left slowly, as if the road had become longer than before. June stayed. Inside the cabin, Mara remained standing even after Garrick was gone. Her body had not understood safety yet. Pip had crawled beneath her belly, nose pressed into her fur, making tiny, hungry noises. Elias placed the signed paper on the kitchen table beside the brass compass. June checked Mara's shoulder again, more to give her hand something useful to do than because the dressing needed changing. She heard his voice and nearly tore herself open, trying to shield the pup. "I saw. That kind of fear has history." "I know." June looked at him then. "Do you?" Elias's eyes lifted. There was no accusation in her face, only a question with a lantern inside it. He looked back at Mara. "Yes," he said. "I do." June left near dusk after making him promise to call if Garrick returned. She also made him promise not to solve the whole county with a crowbar, which was unfair, Elias thought, because he had not even mentioned the crowbar. By night the cabin had settled again, but not into the same peace. Something had entered with Garrick and stayed behind after him. A smell of threat, a shape beyond the windows. Elias checked the locks twice, then once more, because old habits were not always wrong. He sat before the stove with the signed agreement in his hands. The paper was plain, ordinary. A few names, a date, a clumsy signature from a man who had never deserved to write ownership over a living creature. Yet Elias studied it as if it were a battlefield map. He had spent nearly everything he had left. The motorcycle was gone. The emergency fund was gone. The small private comfort of knowing he could disappear if Brightwater became too loud, That was gone too. He expected regret to arrive. It did not. What came instead was heavier and stranger. Responsibility. Mara shifted near the blankets. Elias looked over. She was watching him. The fire lit the amber of her eyes until they seemed almost golden. Slowly, painfully, she rose. Her shoulder trembled, but she crossed the few feet between them. Elias did not move. Mara lowered her head and placed it on the toe of his boot. Not affection, not yet. Something older? Recognition, perhaps? The kind exchanged between survivors who knew that safety was not a place. It was a choice someone kept making, even after it became costly. Pip squeaked from the blanket pile, outraged at being temporarily abandoned. Mara's ear twitched, but she did not move away from Elias immediately. For the first time, he reached down and rested 2 fingers lightly against the air above her head, not touching. "Your call," he whispered. Mara closed her eyes. So he touched her. Just once, barely more than the weight of falling snow. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Somewhere beyond the trees, Garrick Vale was driving back toward whatever master had sent him, carrying Elias's money, and perhaps the first seed of panic. But inside the cabin, beside the fire, a wounded mother had made room for a man in her guarded little world. And Elias understood that the paper on the table had not bought a dog. It had purchased a line he could never uncross. Bright water looked innocent under snow. That was the first thing Elias noticed as he drove into town with Mara in the back seat, and Pip bundled inside a small crate beside her. The road curved down from the pines toward a valley of white roofs, smoking chimneys, and storefront windows glowing gold against the cold. The frozen lake spread behind the town like a polished shield. Sunlight struck its surface and broke into silver fragments, bright enough to make a man forget that deep water still moved beneath. Elias did not forget. Mara sat upright, her torn left ear tilted, her amber eyes fixed on the passing streets. She was stronger than she had been 4 days earlier. June's medicine had helped. Warmth had helped. Food had helped most of all, though Mara still ate like someone expected the bowl to be taken away before the last bite. Pip, on the other hand, had accepted survival with the dignity of a tiny drunk. He rolled against the blanket in his crate, made an indignant squeak, then fell asleep with his pale front paw resting over his nose. Elias glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You're handling public life well," he murmured. Mara looked at him. "I meant him." She looked away, unimpressed. The veterinary clinic sat between a hardware store and a closed bait shop, its windows painted with fading paw prints and a sign that read, "Harlan Animal Care." June had cleared the walkway herself. Elias could tell by the uneven shovel marks and the muttered insult she gave the ice patch near the door when she came out to meet them. "You're early," she said. "You said 10. "I said around 10. That gives polite people room to be late." Elias lifted Pip's crate carefully. "I'll work on being worse." "Please don't. This town has enough talent in that field." Mara stepped out of the truck on her own, slow but steady. June noticed and did not comment too loudly, which Elias appreciated. Praise, like touch, had to be measured with Mara. Too much attention made her stiffen. Inside, the clinic smelled of disinfectant, dry kibble, and old wood warmed by forced heat. A 3-legged orange cat sat on the reception counter like a bitter clerk judging all species equally. Pip sneezed at it. The cat did not blink. June checked Mara's shoulder, changed the dressing, weighed Pip, and wrote notes in a file with the blunt concentration of a woman who trusted paperwork more than promises. "She's healing," June said. "Slower than I'd like, but healing?" Mara watched June's hands the entire time. "And him?" Elias asked. June looked at Pip, who was trying to chew the corner of his own blanket and failing with heroic persistence. "He has decided to remain in the world." "Good. He'll need warmth, milk supplement, and a mother who doesn't collapse from exhaustion." June's expression sharpened slightly. Which means Mara needs quiet. Elias understood what she was really saying. No more Garrick, no more shouting at the door, no more men with keys clattering at their belts. As if summoned by the thought, a truck rumbled past outside. Mara's head snapped toward the window. Her body tightened, not as violently as before, but enough that Pip stopped chewing and went still. June saw it. She recognizes more than his voice, June said quietly. His keys, Elias said. His truck, maybe. Or places. June closed the file. Animals remember geography through fear. A road, a smell, a door. Sometimes their body keeps a map long after the mind stops choosing it. Elias looked at Mara. The dog's gaze remained fixed on the street, but her eyes had gone distant, as if some part of her had left the clinic and returned to a colder place. After the appointment, June suggested Elias stop by Ruth's Bakery for coffee before driving back. She said it casually, but Elias had known June long enough to recognize when she was setting a trap with pastry. "I don't need coffee," he said. "No one needs coffee. Civilization limps along pretending otherwise." "June," she lowered her voice. "People are talking. Better you hear some of it in a warm room than feel it through broken glass later." That was how Elias ended up walking through Brightwater's main street with Mara close at his left side and Pip's crate in one hand. The town was almost too pretty in winter. The barber pole wore a cap of snow. Wreaths hung from lampposts. Someone had tied red ribbons around the young maples along the sidewalk. A statue of a miner stood in the square, beard frosted white, pickaxe raised toward a sky that had no intention of answering. People noticed Mara. That was the second thing Elias noticed. A woman leaving the post office slowed, saw the dog, and looked away quickly. An older man outside the hardware store took off his glove as if to wave, then changed his mind and pretended to check the window display. Two men in insulated work coats stopped talking when Elias passed. Their silence followed him longer than their eyes did. Mara felt it too. She did not growl. She did not hide. She moved with her injured shoulder stiff, head level, body angled slightly between Elias and the world. Not because she trusted the world less than he did, perhaps, but because she had more recent evidence. Ruth Calder's bakery sat on the corner, bright-windowed and warm, with cinnamon fogging the glass from inside. A brass bell rang when Elias opened the door. Heat wrapped around them, thick with the smell of yeast, butter, coffee, and sugar. Behind the counter, Ruth Calder looked up from arranging rolls in a tray. Ruth was 64, round-faced, rosy from ovens, with short silver-blonde hair tucked behind her ears and the calm authority of a woman who had fed half the town through grief, gossip, and church fundraisers. She wore a cream apron dusted with flour and a sweater the color of baked apples. "Well," she said, looking at Mara, then Pip, then Elias. "That explains why June called ahead and told me not to make any sudden noises." Elias looked toward the ceiling. "She called ahead?" "She also said if I asked too many questions, you'd leave, so I'll ask only the useful ones." Ruth came around the counter slowly, stopping several feet away from Mara. "Hungry? For me or the dog?" "Yes." That answer almost drew a smile from him. Ruth set a bowl of water near the wall, not too close, not too far. Mara watched her, weighing the offering. Pip made a small hiccup from the crate. The bakery had 3 customers. All of them suddenly became fascinated by their cups. At a corner table, a woman closed a laptop and stood. She was not dressed like the others. Long camel-colored coat, dark jeans, practical boots, a burgundy scarf looped once around her neck. Her hair was black, cut to her shoulders, with silver strands that caught the light when she moved. Thin, black-framed glasses sat low on her nose. She carried a red notebook under one arm and a small silver recorder in her hand, though she slipped it into her pocket when she approached. "Elias Rowan?" she asked. Elias did not answer right away. The woman noticed. That's a yes from a man who hates being asked questions, Ruth muttered from behind the counter. Lydia, try not to interrogate him before coffee. I was going to wait until after the first sip. Elias looked at Ruth. Lydia Voss, Ruth said. Reporter, troublemaker. Occasionally right, which makes her worse. Lydia extended a hand, then seemed to think better of it when Mara shifted forward. She lowered her hand to her side. I heard about Garrick. Town works fast, Elias said. Small towns don't work fast. They rot slowly and gossip quickly. Ruth placed coffee on Elias's table with enough force to announce that she did not disagree, but preferred kinder vocabulary. Elias sat with his back to the wall. Old habit. Mara settled beneath the table, not fully lying down, while Pip's crate rested beside his boot. Lydia sat across from him only after Ruth nodded, as if the bakery itself required permission. I'm not interested in being a story, Elias said. Good. I'm not interested in writing one about you. That usually means you are. Lydia's mouth twitched. Fair, but not the way you think. She opened the red notebook. Elias saw pages full of dates, names, water rights numbers, and arrows connecting them like roads on a battlefield map. Garrick Vale doesn't wake up one morning and decide to reclaim a starving dog because of sentiment, Lydia said. He does things when someone pays him, scares him, or both. Mara's ear tilted at Garrick's name. Elias saw Lydia notice. She did not push. That earned her one small point. Who would pay him? Elias asked. Lydia looked out the bakery window toward the town hall at the far end of the square. A banner hung across its front steps. Brightwater Winter Renewal Project. Jobs, growth, future. Beneath the banner, the snow was shoveled perfectly. People who need the past to stay buried, Lydia said. Elias followed her gaze. Ruth arrived with a cinnamon roll and a small paper cup of warm broth for Mara. Before either of you gets dramatic, eat something. I'm not dramatic, Lydia said. You carry a red notebook and accuse people over pastries. It's called civic duty. It's called indigestion if you do it before noon. For the first time since leaving the cabin, Elias felt the air loosen. Then Lydia turned the notebook toward him. Crown Basin Development wants to build a winter mineral resort north of town. Hot pools, private cabins, glass spa, heated walkways, the whole rich people sweating in snow fantasy. Elias sipped his coffee. That takes water. A lot of it. Lydia tapped the page. More than they publicly admit. The town council is close to approving a transfer of old community water rights, rights that used to be tied to a cooperative called Brightwater Seed Circle. Elias had heard the name once, maybe twice, from older residents. Always vaguely, like a ghost, people did not want to encourage by speaking clearly. What was it, he asked? Farmers, seed storage, water sharing, irrigation maps, cold weather crops. Started in the 70s, faded in the 90s, supposedly dissolved after a greenhouse collapse and some legal mess. Lydia paused. Except I don't think it dissolved cleanly. I think it was taken apart. Ruth's hands stopped moving behind the counter. That was the first truly loud thing in the bakery. Silence, when it came from the right person, could bang like a dropped pan. Elias looked at her. Ruth resumed wiping the counter, though the spot under her cloth had already been clean. Some things in this town have long roots. Lydia's voice softened. And some people have spent years salting the soil around them. Outside, a sleek black SUV rolled past the bakery. It moved slowly, too slowly for traffic. The windows were tinted. As it passed, the passenger window lowered an inch. Mara stood so fast her shoulder knocked the underside of the table. Pip squeaked. Elias's hand went to the crate. The SUV continued down the street and turned toward the town hall. Lydia did not look surprised. That, she said, is why people stopped talking. Who was it? Maybe nobody. Maybe a reminder. Elias looked around the bakery. The customers had lowered their eyes again. One man left money on the table and walked out without finishing his coffee. The town had not become afraid in that moment. It had revealed that it already was. After leaving the bakery, Elias drove the long way home at Lydia's suggestion. Not because she asked him to follow anyone. She was careful not to make him part of her investigation. But she mentioned, casually, that Garrick's scrapyard sat near the old access road to the cooperative greenhouse. "Nothing to see there," she had said, which meant, "Look, but do not get caught looking." Elias told himself he was only learning the town's shape. Mara rode beside Pip in the back seat, restless now. The road left Main Street, past the last row of houses, and bent toward a stretch of pines where the snow lay less disturbed. A chain-link fence appeared beyond the trees, sagging in places, patched in others with sheet metal and old signs. Beyond it rose piles of rusted cars, broken farm equipment, oil drums, and twisted beams. Garrick Vale's scrapyard looked like a graveyard where machines went after being denied a proper burial. Mara's breathing changed. Elias slowed the truck. She did not bark. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, she made a low sound from deep in her chest, almost a whine, almost a warning, her eyes fixed not on the scrapyard office, but on the woods behind it. There, half hidden beyond the fence, an old track disappeared between the pines. Snow had covered most of it, but not all. Something had used it recently. Tires, maybe. A narrow path pressed down, leading away from the yard toward land, marked by a weather-beaten sign. No trespassing unsafe structure. Town property. Mara put one paw against the back door. "No," Elias said softly. "Not today." Her head turned toward him. There was no obedience in her face, no plea either, only recognition. She knew that road, not as a map in the mind, perhaps, but as a scent line burned into the body. A passage between fear and shelter, between being trapped and almost being safe. Elias kept driving. It was one of the hardest small choices he had made in a long time. At home, the afternoon light faded early. Winter clouds gathered over the lake, turning the sky the color of tin. Elias checked the cabin locks before feeding Mara and Pip. Then he walked the property line, as he often did when unease gathered in him like weather. Near the back fence, he found the cut. One clean slice through the wire. Not old. The metal shone bright where it had been clipped. Elias crouched, gloved fingers touching the brake. The snow beneath showed one partial boot print already softening at the edges. He stood slowly and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. That evening he found the bottle. It lay shattered on the front porch, brown glass scattered across the boards. The smell of cheap whiskey rose through the cold. A folded note had been tucked under the boot scraper, weighed down by a piece of rusted metal. Elias opened it beneath the porch light. The handwriting was blocky and uneven. "Keep the dog inside. Don't let her lead you where you don't belong." For a long while, Elias did not move. Inside the cabin, Mara began to growl. Not at the door. Not at the note. Toward the dark line of trees beyond the yard. Elias folded the paper once and slipped it into his pocket beside the brass compass. He understood something then, not the whole shape of it, but enough. Mara was not magic. She was not a key sent by fate to unlock a hidden treasure. She was a mother who had survived long enough to remember the places that hurt and the places that almost saved her. But someone else knew what she remembered, and that made her dangerous. Later, after the glass was swept, after Pip had fed, after Mara finally lay down with her body curved around him, Elias walked to the dock behind the cabin. The frozen lake glowed under a break in the clouds. Moonlight spread across the ice in pale sheets. Brightwater slept on the far shore, all warm windows and polite silence. It was beautiful, almost gentle. Elias stood there with his boots planted in snow, the warning note heavy in his pocket, the compass cold against his fingers. Beneath the ice, Water moved. Beneath the town, fear moved too. And somewhere behind Garrick Vale's scrapyard, beneath pines and old snow and signs warning people away, there was a road Mara knew by heart. Elias looked back toward the cabin. Through the window he could see Mara lift her head, watching him from the firelight. She had crossed the snow once for her pup. Now it seemed the whole town was waiting to see whether anyone else would be brave enough to cross something of their own. Mara began before sunrise, not with barking, not with panic. Something quieter, and for that reason more difficult to ignore. Elias woke to the sound of claws scraping wood. At first, he thought she was scratching at the blanket nest near the stove. Pip had recently developed the grand ambition of escaping his crate, usually by pushing his entire body against one corner and looking offended when architecture won. But the sound came again, steady and urgent. Scrape, pause, scrape. Elias sat up on the narrow bed in the loft and listened. Below, the cabin was blue with winter dawn. The fire had burned low. Frost feathered the window corners. Mara stood at the front door, her left ear tilted, her body tense but not terrified. Pip wobbled near the stove in a small padded pen Elias had built from scrap wood and wire mesh, making soft, impatient noises because his mother had moved out of reach. "Mara," Elias called softly. She looked up at him, then she scratched the door again. There was no storm outside, no truck in the yard, no voice calling from the trees. This was not the fear she had shown when Garrick came. It was not the rigid dread that had taken her at the scrapyard road. This was insistence. Elias came downstairs, pulling on his boots and the old olive combat shirt with camouflage sleeves before reaching for his field jacket. He opened the door just a crack. Cold air pushed in. Mara slipped her nose through the gap and sniffed the morning. Then she looked back at him, almost impatient. "Not alone," Elias said. She did not care for his rules. That much was clear. He called June first, then Lydia. June answered like a woman who had been awake for an hour and resented the world for confirming it. "Is anyone bleeding?" "Not currently." "That's not as comforting as you think. Mara wants out, toward the woods, I think, toward Garrick's side." The silence changed. "I'll bring my bag," June said. Lydia answered on the second ring. "If you're calling before sunrise," she said, "either someone died or someone finally read a town budget." "Mara wants to go somewhere." A brief pause. "Do not go without me." "I wasn't planning to." "That sounds like something men say after planning to." Elias looked down at Mara. She stared at the door as if the whole mountain had placed a summons there. "Bring your recorder," he said. By the time both women arrived, the eastern sky had begun to pale behind the pines. June came in her navy parka, medical bag slung over one shoulder. Lydia wore a dark winter coat, burgundy scarf, and boots made for actual snow rather than newspaper offices. A red notebook poked from her pocket. June looked at Pip, who was trying to chew the corner of his blanket with grave determination. "Who's watching him?" Elias lifted a small carrier lined with wool. "He comes with us, unless you think that's worse." June studied Mara. "Mara won't leave him." She made that clear. Lydia looked from the dog to the trees. "And we're following the mother dog into posted land before breakfast." "We're following memory," June said. Lydia's mouth tightened. Memory has terrible taste in destinations. Mara led them around the lake road first, then cut toward the old track behind Garrick's scrapyard. Elias kept her on a long paracord lid, not to control her, but to keep her from vanishing into brush or trouble. She moved with purpose, nose low, injured shoulder still a little stiff but stronger than before. The scrapyard fence appeared through the pines like a line of rusted teeth. Beyond it, broken trucks sat under snow. A crane arm rose crookedly above the wreckage. Nothing moved inside, though Elias had the unpleasant feeling that the place was not empty. Mara did not approach the main gate. She turned away from it. Behind the yard, the old track sank between dense pines. Snow nearly swallowed it, but under the white, lay the pressed memory of tires and boots. A weathered sign leaned against a tree, half covered in frost. No trespassing unsafe structure town property. Lydia took a picture. "For the record," she said. "For the lawsuit?" June asked. "For when someone claims this sign was never here." They moved on. The forest closed around them. Branches held snow like folded wings. The morning light was clean and bright, but sound behaved strangely in the trees. Every step seemed both too loud and too small. Pip made a sleepy squeak in the carrier against June's chest. Mara glanced back at the sound, then pressed forward again. After 15 minutes, the pines opened. The greenhouse stood in a shallow basin beneath the slope, half buried in winter. It must once have been beautiful. Even ruined, it had the bones of a cathedral. Tall panes of glass rose in broken rows, some missing, some cracked into pale spiderwebs. Frost clung to the metal ribs. Dead vines twisted along the frame. Snow had drifted through the gaps and settled over old planting tables, rusted barrels, and collapsed wooden flats where green things had once been coaxed from frozen months. At the far end, faded letters still marked a board above the main entrance. Brightwater Seed Circle. The words were nearly gone, but not gone enough. Lydia stopped walking. For once, she did not reach for the notebook. "My father used to talk about this place," she said quietly. "Like it was a church, except with tomatoes." June looked at her. "That sounds like a very Idaho religion." "He said people came here to trade seeds, borrow pump parts, argue about water schedules, and pretend they weren't gossiping." Lydia's expression shifted. "Then one winter the roof failed. After that everyone said it wasn't safe. The town fenced off the access road. The records got moved. Or lost. Depends who was telling the story." Mara pulled gently on the lead. Elias let her guide them inside. The greenhouse smelled of cold metal, old soil, wet wood, and something faintly sweet beneath decay. Mara did not explore randomly. She went past the central tables, past a cracked clay pot, past a line of empty hooks where tools had once hung. She reached a rear corner partly hidden by collapsed shelving, and stopped. There, tucked behind a leaning bench, lay a nest of burlap sacks and dry straw. Not new, not ancient either. June knelt. Her face changed. "There's dog hair here," she said, "and old food wrappers." Lydia crouched beside her. "Someone fed her?" "Maybe. Or she stole what she could and brought it here." June touched the edge of a sack. "This corner would block wind. The soil bed beneath might hold warmth longer than concrete." Mara lowered her head to the straw and breathed in. Not like a dog searching. Like a pilgrim kneeling at the last place where mercy had not completely failed. Elias felt his throat tighten, but he said nothing. Pity could insult a survivor if it arrived wearing the wrong face. Pip stirred in the carrier. Mara turned at once. June lowered herself so Mara could sniff him. The mother touched her nose to the puppy's head, reassured herself that he still belonged to the living, then looked back toward the corner. Her paw scraped at the floor. Not wildly, not like before. Once, then again. Elias moved closer. Beneath the straw, the floorboards were not floorboards at all. They were old planks laid over a square frame. One edge had rotted soft from years of meltwater. Elias brushed away dirt and ice. A rusted iron ring appeared beneath his glove. Lydia whispered, "Please tell me that's for drainage." June looked at Elias. "Do greenhouses normally need hidden doors?" "I fixed boat engines," Elias said, "not vegetable temples." He tried the ring. It did not move. The wood groaned, but held. Lydia was already dialing. "I know someone who owes me 3 favors and owns every tool invented before 1994. Clay Morrow arrived 40 minutes later in a battered yellow pickup that sounded like it had survived by spite. He stepped out short, solid, and scowling, with a gray beard trimmed close to a square jaw and hands so stained with machine oil they looked permanently shadowed. A faded orange knit cap sat crooked on his head. He eyed Elias first, then June, then Lydia, then Mara. "This better not be about ghosts," he said. Lydia tucked her phone away. "Good morning to you too, Clay." "Morning was fine before you called." "We need a door opened." Clay looked at the iron ring. His expression changed faster than he wanted anyone to notice. "Well," he muttered, "I'll be damned." "You know it?" Elias asked. Clay spat to the side, not indoors, but close enough to express an opinion. "My old man worked on this place, said there was a cold cellar under the rear beds, for seeds, maybe documents, maybe jars of pickled nonsense. Town sealed it after the collapse." "Can you open it?" Clay gave him a flat look. "Son, I've opened tractors that were angrier than this." He worked with a pry bar, a small hand winch, and insults so specific they seemed custom-made for rust. Elias helped, bracing the frame while Clay loosened the swollen boards. June kept Pip warm. Lydia photographed everything. At last, the hatch lifted. Cold air breathed up from below. Not the dead, rotten air Elias expected. Dry air, earthy, preserved. A narrow set of wooden steps descended into darkness. Clay shone a flashlight down. "Still holding?" "Mostly?" June asked. "Mostly is a proud tradition in rural construction." Elias went first. The cellar was larger than expected. Metal cabinets lined one wall. Wooden crates sat stacked beneath canvas covers. Glass jars filled with seeds rested on shelves, marked in handwriting, faded but legible. Winter rye, blue corn, dry beans, cold wheat, mountain barley. Along another wall hung rolled maps tied with string. A work table stood in the center, dusty but intact, with ledgers sealed inside plastic sleeves. There was no gold, no jewels, no chest waiting for a chosen hero. Only paper, seed, ink, and the stubborn evidence of people who had once believed the future was something a town could prepare together. Lydia came down behind him and stopped. "Oh," she said. It was the softest word Elias had heard from her. Clay's flashlight landed on a framed photograph propped against a cabinet, a group of farmers and townspeople standing before the greenhouse decades earlier, grinning in winter coats, holding seed trays and coffee mugs. Clay moved closer. His face hardened. "That's my father," he said. No one spoke. Clay reached out, then stopped before touching the glass. The man in the photograph had Clay's square jaw, but his smile belonged to a different species entirely, one that had not yet learned to guard itself with bitterness. Lydia began opening ledgers. Water schedules, cooperative agreements, family contributions, irrigation routes. Elias unrolled one map carefully. Blue lines threaded from springs above the lake down through farms, fields, and old storage ponds. Handwritten notes marked shared wells, reserve tanks, emergency winter access. June looked over his shoulder. "This wasn't just gardening." "No," Lydia said. Her voice had regained its edge, but there was wonder under it now. "This was infrastructure." Clay had found another folder. His hands, so sure with tools, shook slightly as he opened it. "What is it?" Elias asked. Clay stared at the page. "My father's name." Lydia moved beside him. The document looked newer than the ledgers. Different paper. Computer printed. A transfer form. Clay's father, Everett Morrow, listed as consenting to release inherited water shares to a private holding company connected to Crown Basin Development. Clay laughed once. It was not humor. It was the sound a fence makes before it breaks. "My father was dead 6 years before this date." Lydia took the page carefully, as if handling something poisonous. She found another, then another. Names of the dead, names of the elderly, signatures too neat, too convenient. Transfers folded into language about modernization, stewardship, regional economic opportunity. Mayor Crow's name did not appear directly. That made Elias trust it less, not more. They didn't steal a treasure, Lydia said. They changed the definition of ownership while everyone was grieving, broke, or too tired to fight. Clay's face had gone gray under its weathered red. "All these years," he said, "I thought we just lost. I thought Dad failed. I thought I failed after him." Elias looked at the seeds on the shelves, at the maps, at the dry little jars that had waited in darkness while Brightwater learned to bow. "Maybe you didn't lose," he said. "Maybe someone moved the finish line and called it law." Clay looked at him then, and for the first time his scowl was not armor. It was pain with no better clothing. Above them, Mara barked, once, sharp. Elias froze. Another bark followed, lower this time. He motioned Lydia to gather the newer documents. June climbed up first, with Pip. Clay shut 2 cabinet doors and grabbed the folder with his father's name. Elias took the old water map and 1 ledger, then followed. When he emerged into the greenhouse, Garrick Vale stood near the entrance with 2 men Elias did not recognize. Garrick looked different in daylight when he was not pretending to be in control. His face was pale beneath the drink-red skin. His keys hung silent at his belt because one hand gripped them hard enough to stop the clatter. The 2 men with him wore dark winter jackets without logos, their boots too clean for the scrapyard, their eyes doing quiet math over every person in the room. "Well," Garrick said, "ain't this a church meeting?" Mara stood between him and June. Pip's carrier hung against June's chest. Mara's body blocked it entirely. Her ribs were less visible now, her stance stronger, but Elias could still see the tremor in her injured shoulder. Elias stepped forward. "Turn around," he said. "Leave." Garrick laughed, but his eyes flicked toward the hatch. "Town property. You're trespassing." "So are you." "I got permission." "From who?" Garrick's mouth moved, then shut. Lydia shifted slightly behind Elias, sliding folded papers beneath her coat. Her other hand moved toward her pocket. The recorder. One of the clean-booted men noticed. "No recording." Lydia smiled with no warmth. "Then say something worth denying." The man moved toward her. Elias stepped into his path. The greenhouse seemed to tighten around them. Broken glass, snow, old seeds sleeping underground, a wounded dog holding the line in front of a puppy. Garrick pointed at Mara. "That dog's caused enough trouble." Mara growled. "Funny," June said, voice calm but pale with anger. "She probably thinks the same of you." Garrick took a step forward. Mara did not attack. That mattered. She planted herself instead, head low, body square. She was not protecting herself from Garrick now. She was protecting June, Pip, and the doorway to the cellar behind them. Her fear had not vanished. It had chosen a shape. Elias saw the choice and understood it. He did not need to win here, not today. He needed everyone to leave with enough truth to matter. "Clay," he said without looking away from Garrick, "take June out the side." "There is no side." "There's always a side. You're a mechanic." Clay swore softly and began moving. The clean-booted man lunged for Lydia's coat. Elias caught his wrist, turned with the motion, and put the man down against a planting table hard enough to stop him, not hard enough to break him. Pain flashed across the man's face. Elias released him immediately and stepped back. "Don't," Elias said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Garrick had gone still. He had seen, for 1 second, the difference between a man who wanted a fight and a man who had spent years learning how quickly a fight could end. Lydia backed toward the broken side panel Clay had opened. June went first with Pip. Mara moved backward only when June was behind her. Clay followed, carrying the folder in one hand and his pry bar in the other. Elias left last. Before he stepped into the snow, he looked back at Garrick. The man's fear was clearer now. Not fear of Elias. Fear of having failed someone else. Outside, they moved fast through the trees, not running, not until the greenhouse vanished behind them. Mara stayed close to June, checking Pip every few steps. Lydia did not speak until they reached the old road. Then she pulled the recorder from her pocket. The red light was still blinking. Clay stared at it. "You got that?" "Enough," Lydia said. June looked at the folder under Clay's arm. "And that?" Clay held it tighter. "This," he said, voice rough, "is my father climbing out of a grave to call somebody a liar." No one laughed, but Elias almost did, not because it was funny, but because grief sometimes arrived carrying the wrong hat. They reached the trucks near the road as the sun broke fully over the ridge. The light struck the greenhouse roof behind them, turning the cracked glass briefly golden. For one impossible moment, the ruined place shone. Then the clouds moved, and it became what it was again, old, damaged, dangerous, and still standing. Elias looked down at Mara. She was breathing hard. Snow clung to her whiskers. Her amber eyes were fixed on the trees behind them, where the men they had left would already be making calls. The secret was no longer buried, but neither were they. And in Elias's jacket, beside the brass compass, the old water map pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. By noon the next day, Brightwater had learned to say Elias Rowan's name differently, not loudly. Small towns rarely needed volume. They could ruin a man in softer ways. A pause before answering him at the hardware store, a curtain shifting when his truck rolled past, two old friends lowering their voices as he stepped onto the sidewalk. It was not open hatred. Open hatred had courage in it. This was something thinner and more poisonous. Suspicion poured drop by drop. Lydia Voss published her first report at 7:13 that morning. She did not publish everything. Elias had watched her decide what to hold back at Ruth's Bakery, her red notebook open beside a cooling cup of coffee, the old water map spread carefully between them. She posted the recorded threat from the greenhouse, a photograph of the hidden cellar, and a cautious summary of the questionable water transfer documents. She did not name every person yet. She did not accuse beyond what she could prove. "That restraint is going to make people think I've matured," she had said. Ruth, wiping flour from her hands, had replied, "Don't worry, dear. No one who knows you will panic." For 1 hour, nothing happened. Then everything did. The town hall announced a press conference for 3 o'clock. By 2:45, the steps of Brightwater's municipal building were shoveled clean. A Christmas tree stood near the entrance, decorated with white lights and silver ornaments shaped like snowflakes. Wreaths hung in every window. Behind the lectern, a blue banner stretched between two columns. Brightwater, winter renewal jobs. Growth, future. Mayor Preston Crow stood beneath it like he had been designed to belong there. He was 57, tall and trim, with silver hair combed back so neatly it seemed less styled than engineered. His wool overcoat was charcoal, his scarf pale gray, his gloves black leather. He had the kind of face that made donors comfortable, long, clean, thoughtful, never flushed by anger, never marked by labor. His smile was narrow but warm enough for cameras. Elias watched from across the street, standing near the statue in the town square. Mara sat beside his left leg, wearing the green paracord collar he had braided for her the night before. Pip was safe at the cabin with June's assistant, and Elias was grateful for that. Whatever was about to happen did not need a puppy in the middle of it. Lydia stood closer to the steps with her recorder visible, which was either brave or deliberately annoying. Possibly both. Crow began with gratitude. He thanked the volunteers who shoveled sidewalks, the business owners who kept Main Street alive, the families who had weathered hard seasons with dignity. He spoke of the resort project as if it were not steel, glass, water consumption, and contracts, but a lantern carried into winter. "Brightwater deserves opportunity," he said. "Our people deserve jobs that will keep their sons and daughters from leaving, investments that will strengthen our tax base, and a future that does not depend on nostalgia." The crowd murmured approval. Elias felt Mara lean slightly against his boot. Then Crow's tone changed so subtly that only a careful listener would have heard the blade slide free. "Unfortunately," the mayor continued, "there are individuals who would rather frighten this town with rumors than build anything useful." A disgruntled former reporter, a recently arrived veteran living outside town, and an animal with a troubled history have now been placed at the center of a story designed to cast doubt on legitimate development. Lydia's jaw tightened. Elias did not move. Crow never said Elias was unstable. He did not have to. He spoke instead of isolation, untreated trauma, and the danger of letting emotion replace fact. He spoke of Mara as a large German shepherd of uncertain background and said the town must be careful not to romanticize dangerous animals. He smiled as he said it. That was what made it work. He did not sound cruel. He sounded concerned. The old poison wore a doctor's coat. "We must not allow fear to rule us," Crow said. And somehow, with those words, he handed fear a badge. By evening, Ruth's Bakery had 3 canceled catering orders. Lydia received a formal warning from the regional paper that still owned part of her old column. June's clinic had 2 clients call to ask whether it was safe to bring small dogs there if she was involved with that shepherd case. At 9:30, someone threw a stone through June's front clinic window. No one was hurt. The rock landed in the waiting room beside a jar of dog biscuits. June called Elias not because she needed help sweeping glass, but because she knew he would hear about it and blame himself if she did not let him arrive with a broom. When he got there, she was already taping cardboard over the broken pane. Mara sniffed the sidewalk outside, restless but controlled. June looked down at her. "Don't worry, I've had worse reviews." "That's not funny." It was a little funny. Elias picked up a shard of glass with gloved fingers. "This is because of me." June stopped taping. "No," she said. "This is because someone threw a rock." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "Do not steal other people's guilt. You'll only make them lighter." He had no answer for that. The next 2 days moved like ice cracking under weight. Not enough to break. Enough to warn. At the grocery store, a woman Elias had cleared snow for all winter turned her cart into another aisle when she saw him. At the gas station, 2 men stopped speaking when he entered. A handwritten sign appeared on a bulletin board near the post office. "Keep Brightwater safe. No dangerous dogs in public spaces." Someone had drawn a crude black and tan dog beneath the words. Elias tore it down. Then he stood there, paper clenched in his fist, while 3 people pretended not to watch. Mara waited beside him, her torn ear tipped toward the street. She had stopped trembling at every passing truck, but tension lived in her like a second skeleton. She did not understand politics. She understood threat. Perhaps that made her wiser. That night, a vehicle stopped outside the cabin. The sound came just after midnight. Tires on packed snow. Engine idling. Then silence. Elias woke fully before he opened his eyes. His body had its own old alarms, bells rung by years no calendar could reach. Mara stood at the foot of the bed, head low, listening. Pip slept in his pen downstairs, now healthy enough to dream with twitching paws. The vehicle did not honk. No one knocked. It only waited. Elias took the flashlight from the bedside table and moved to the window. Nothing showed but darkness between pines and the faint red glow of taillights down the drive. Then the lights went out. His breath shortened before he could command it back. Not fear of a man outside. Not exactly. It was the old collapsing distance between then and now. Snow became dust. Trees became walls. Darkness became a place where decisions arrived too fast and left permanent names behind. Elias forced himself down the stairs, one hand on the railing, the other pressed against the brass compass in his pocket. He did not take the rifle from the cabinet. He wanted to. That was why he did not. The vehicle started again and drove away. Nothing happened. That was the worst of it. Elias made it as far as the barn before his body betrayed him. He sat on an overturned feed bucket near the workbench, the flashlight rolling from his hand. Tools hung on the wall like silent witnesses. His breath came sharp and shallow. Sweat cooled under the collar of his combat shirt. The barn smelled of hay, oil, old wood, and winter metal. He pressed both hands against his knees. "Not here," he whispered. "Not now." But the mind, when frightened, was a cruel storyteller. It did not care where a man was. It chose its own scenery. The barn door creaked. Mara slipped inside. Elias lifted one hand slightly. "Stay back." She did not. She came slowly, not like an obedient dog answering a command, but like a mother approaching a wounded member of the pack. She did not jump, did not whine, did not demand. She simply crossed the straw-littered floor and pressed her body against his leg. Her warmth found him through the fabric. Her breathing was steady. In and out, in and out. Elias stared at the scarred wood beneath his boots. His fingers unclenched one at a time. Mara leaned harder, as if bracing him against an invisible wind. She had not been trained for this. No command had taught her to count a man's breath. No handler had shaped her into a service dog. She only knew what mothers knew before a language. When something in the living circle begins to break, stay close enough that it remembers it is not alone. A sound came from Elias then, small and broken, almost a laugh. "You're bossy," he said. Mara blinked. You and June would get along. Her tail moved once, not a wag, an acknowledgment from the Queen. By morning the vehicle was gone, but its tracks remained at the end of the drive. Elias photographed them. He called Dale Mercer and left a message. The sheriff called back 2 hours later and said he would keep an eye out. Elias nearly threw the phone across the room. He did not. That was progress of a sort. Near noon, an old sedan climbed the cabin road. Elias watched it approach from the porch, Mara beside him. This car did not crawl like a threat. It moved carefully, tires finding the ruts, engine coughing in the cold. When it stopped, an elderly man stepped out with a wooden cane and a long brown coat, buttoned wrong at the top. He was thin, but not fragile. His white hair stuck out from beneath a felt hat, and his face had the dry, folded look of parchment that had survived fire. His eyes were pale blue and uncomfortably awake. "Elias Rowan?" he called. "Yes." Otis Bell. The name meant nothing at first. Then Elias remembered Lydia mentioning him. Retired judge, former county mediator, hermit by temperament and possibly by choice. Otis looked at Mara. "That the dog causing all this civic trembling?" Mara stared back. Otis nodded. "Sensible animal." Elias opened the cabin door. "Coffee?" "Only if it's bad. Good coffee makes people talk too long." Inside, Otis removed his hat and sat at the kitchen table without waiting to be invited further. He moved like a man accustomed to courtrooms, old chairs, and the patience of dust. Elias poured coffee. Otis took one sip, grimaced, and seemed reassured. "I handled Brightwater Seed Circle documents years ago," Otis said. Elias sat across from him. Mara lay near the stove, but her eyes remained on the old man. Otis placed a folder on the table. It was thin, tied with string, the edges softened by age. "The cooperative had a safeguard clause," he continued. "Unusual one. Smart, though. Farmers back then trusted weather more than politicians, and not by much." Elias said nothing. Otis untied the string with slow fingers. "If water rights tied to the seed circle were ever transferred under suspected fraud, those transfers could be frozen pending review. But the petition has to be brought by recognized representatives of at least 3 founding families or their legal successors." "Clay Morrow would count?" "If we can prove succession, yes." "What about the others?" Otis looked toward the window where the lake shone between the trees. Old, gone, scared. Some signed things they didn't understand. Some were told their claims expired. Some stopped fighting because fighting costs money, sleep, and friends. Elias thought of the town square, the lowered eyes, the rock through June's window, crows smiling beneath white Christmas lights. "Why come to me?" Elias asked. Otis's mouth tightened. "Because Lydia can find facts. June can prove harm. Clay can prove history. But you? I'm not from here." "No," Otis said. "That may be the one thing in your favor. You haven't spent 30 years learning which names not to say." The words settled between them. Elias looked down at the folder. Inside were copies of bylaws, handwritten notes, old seals, and names that meant little to him now but had once meant land, water, work, survival. "I'm not a lawyer," he said. "Good. Lawyers complicate morality until it bills hourly." Despite himself, Elias almost smiled. Otis leaned forward, and the humor left his face. "Listen carefully. This will not be won by finding one dramatic document and waving it under Crow's nose. That man eats paper for breakfast. You need people, living people, names, testimony, 3 families willing to stand in public and say the water was stolen." Elias looked toward Mara. She had laid her head near Pip's pen. The puppy had crawled close to the mesh and fallen asleep with one paw pressed against his mother's muzzle. 3 families, Elias thought. Not one soldier, not one dog, not one reporter with a red notebook. A town had been taught to bow. It would have to decide, person by person, whether it remembered how to stand. Otis finished his terrible coffee and rose. At the door, he paused. "One more thing," he said. "Crow's danger is not that people believe every word he says. It's that he gives them permission not to act on what they already know." Elias stood in the doorway long after the old judge drove away. The winter light had changed. The snow no longer looked soft. It looked like a page no one had dared write on. Behind him, Mara gave a quiet sound. Elias turned. She was watching him, not asking where they would go, not demanding a road, simply waiting to see what choice he would make next. He picked up the folder Otis had left and placed it beside the old water map and the signed paper that had bought Mara's freedom. No guns, no grand speeches, no enemies charging over a hill, just names, documents, fear. And somewhere in Brightwater, 3 people who might still remember that water once belonged to everyone. Elias touched the brass compass in his pocket. For the first time in years, it did not feel like a relic. It felt like an instruction. They began with names, not weapons, not headlines, not speeches under bright lights. Names. Otis Bell wrote them on a yellow legal pad at Ruth Calder's bakery, while snow tapped gently against the front windows and the ovens breathed cinnamon into the room. His handwriting was old-fashioned, narrow and disciplined, the kind of script that made even grocery lists look like court orders. Morrow, Weller, Pike, Hensley, Calder, Rusk. "Founding families," Otis said, tapping the page with one thin finger. "Some gone, some stubborn, some scared enough to pretend they're gone." Clay Morrow sat at the end of the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he had not touched. The folder containing his father's false transfer document lay beside him. He looked at it as if it were a dead animal someone expected him to bury. Lydia had her red notebook open. June sat near the window, watching Main Street through the reflection of her own tired face. Elias stood rather than sat, because sitting made him feel like they were planning something smaller than what this was. Mara lay beneath the table, close to Pip's carrier. Pip had grown bolder by the hour. He had discovered Ruth's bakery crumbs and now believed the entire human economy should be reorganized around them. Ruth slid a plate of rolls onto the table. "If you're going to go knocking on doors and making old people remember things they paid good money to forget, at least eat first." Lydia picked up a roll. "That is the most cheerful description of civic duty I've ever heard." "It isn't civic duty," Ruth said. "It's housekeeping. This town has had dirt under the rug for too long." The first house belonged to the Hensleys. Elias did not say much there. That became his role quickly, not leading, not pushing, simply standing present enough that people understood the visit mattered. Lydia asked questions. Otis explained the legal need. June watched for exhaustion. Clay stared at floors and doorframes, seeing old farmhouses as if they were machines he could no longer fix. Mrs. Hensley was 81, small and bird-boned, with a voice like paper rubbed together. She remembered the seed circle. She remembered bringing jars of beans to the greenhouse. She remembered a letter threatening legal fees if she contested a water transfer after her husband died. "Did you keep the letter?" Lydia asked gently. Mrs. Hensley looked toward a hallway lined with family photographs. "I kept everything," she said. "Women of my generation were told not to make trouble, so we made filing cabinets instead." At the second house, an old couple let them stand on the porch in the cold for nearly 10 minutes before opening the door. Mr. Rusk had once managed pump schedules for the cooperative. Now his hands shook too badly to hold a pen, and his wife answered most questions for him with a tightness that said fear had not softened with age. "We signed what they told us to sign," she said. "They said the rights were expired anyway." "Who said?" Lydia asked. Mrs. Rusk looked at Elias, then at Mara, waiting in the snow beyond the steps. Her mouth trembled. "No one says names in Brightwater unless they're ready to lose something." They left with no signature from the Rusks. But as Elias turned toward the truck, Mr. Rusk opened the door again and called out, "The old pump house had copies." His wife hissed his name. The old man lifted his chin, pale eyes watering in the cold. "I'm tired, Helen. I'm tired of being quiet for men who never miss a meal." It was not a victory. It was a crack. By late afternoon, Elias understood what Otis had meant. This was not a search for information. It was a search for courage that had been buried alive. Each house had its own weather. Shame in one kitchen, anger in another. Grief sitting in a recliner beside a silent television. A man who refused to open the door but watched from behind lace curtains. A widow who offered tea, then denied knowing anything while her hands shook over the cups. Mara changed the way people looked at them. Not because she performed miracles. She simply stood there, scarred, ear-tilted, body between Pip and the world. Some people saw the dog and looked away, embarrassed by what they had ignored. Others softened. A few whispered, "That's the shepherd from the scrapyard," as if saying the name of a ghost. At dusk, Otis directed them to a narrow road above the lake. "Nadine Weller," he said, "former bookkeeper for the Seed Circle. If anyone kept copies, it would be Nadine. If anyone refuses to talk, it will also be Nadine." Her house sat alone behind a line of birches, small and pale blue, with a porch sagging under snow. Frozen wind chimes hung near the door. They made no music at first, only tiny glass clicks when the wind moved them. Nadine opened after the third knock. She was 73, slight and bent, but not frail, wrapped in a plum-colored coat over a teal cardigan. Her white hair had been pinned carefully, though wisps had escaped around her temples. Her eyes were dark and sharp behind the watery shine of age. When she saw Otis, she said, "No." "Nadine?" "No." She began to close the door. Then Mara stepped into view. Nadine stopped. The change in her face was so sudden, Elias felt the cold differently. Her mouth opened slightly. One hand rose to her chest, fingers curling around a small silver cross. "Oh," she whispered, "you lived." Mara did not move forward. She only stood in the snow, Pip tucked warm in the carrier against June's chest. The mother dog's amber eyes rested on Nadine without fear, without recognition perhaps, but with the solemn patience of a creature used to waiting outside doors. Nadine began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. The tears simply spilled over, as if they had been waiting behind her eyes for months and the sight of Mara had turned the key. "I left food," Nadine said. "At the greenhouse, when I could. Bread, scraps, once a can of beef stew, though I suppose that was too much salt." She gave a broken, embarrassed laugh. "I told myself it was enough because I was afraid to do more." June's face softened. It mattered. Nadine looked at Pip. There were more, weren't there? No one answered. They did not need to. Nadine stepped back from the door. Come in before I lose my nerve. Her house smelled of lavender, dust, and old paper. The living room was lined with bookshelves and framed photographs of Brightwater before it learned to polish its lies. Nadine made no tea, offered no performance of hospitality. She went straight to a hall closet, knelt with difficulty, and pulled out a round tin printed with faded sunflowers. Her hands shook as she placed it on the table. I should have taken this to the county years ago, she said. Otis sat across from her. Why didn't you? Nadine looked toward the window, where the frozen chimes clicked softly. Because they came to my house at night, she said. Not Crow himself. Men like Garrick, men who smell like gas station whiskey and believe cruelty is a form of employment. They told me old women fall, old houses burn, papers disappear. She touched the lid of the tin. So I hid what I could and became smaller. Clay stood near the wall, jaw tight. Nadine opened the tin. Inside were folded bylaws, copied meeting minutes, original water share lists, and a letter she had written years ago but never mailed. Lydia photographed each document carefully. Otis read with the grave concentration of a priest examining relics. Elias saw names now familiar: Morrow, Hensley, Rusk, Weller, rights held in trust, transfers requiring witnessed consent, emergency clauses, protective provisions, not treasure that shone, treasure that testified. Nadine pulled one page free and handed it to Clay. Your father argued against the first transfer, she said. He said water was not a luxury. He said selling it would be like selling the town's blood and calling it progress. Clay looked at the page. For a moment, he was no longer the bitter mechanic with grease under his nails. He was a son standing late at the door of a room where his father had been waiting for years. His voice came out rough. I thought he gave up. No, Nadine said. He was outnumbered. The wind moved the chimes outside. This time they rang, thin, frozen, beautiful. Elias felt the sound settle in the room like a blessing too shy to name itself. When they left Nadine's house, she came to the porch despite the cold. Mara paused at the steps. Nadine did not reach for her. She only lowered one hand, palm open. Mara sniffed the air. Then, very gently, she touched her nose to Nadine's fingers. Nadine closed her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. Mara turned back toward Elias as if apologies belonged to the living only if they led somewhere. That night, the sky over Brightwater glowed strangely. At first, Elias thought it was low cloud reflecting town lights. Then the phone rang. Lydia. The greenhouse is burning. By the time Elias reached the cabin door, Mara was already there, barking in short, sharp bursts that tore through the rooms. He had returned from town an hour earlier, with smoke clinging faintly to his jacket from Ruth's wood oven and diesel from Clay's truck. Mara had been restless since then, nosing his sleeve, circling, returning to the door. Now she was frantic, not wild, certain. Elias grabbed his coat. Pip stays. June was supposed to be at the clinic. Then Elias's phone rang again. Clay this time. June went back, he said, voice hard with panic. She wanted samples from the cellar before the fire department sealed it. I'm heading there. Elias did not waste a word. He drove fast, but not recklessly. Mara braced in the passenger seat. The old greenhouse came into view through the trees, and for one terrible second it looked like a lantern built by madmen. Flames moved along one side of the roof, where dry framing had caught. Snow kept the fire from spreading into the forest, but smoke poured low and thick through the broken glass. Clay's yellow truck was already there. Lydia stood near the access road, phone pressed to her ear, one hand holding her recorder toward the fire. "Dispatch is coming," she shouted, "but the road's icy. They're slow." "Where's June?" Clay pointed toward the rear. "Cellar entrance. Beam came down. I can't get it by hand." Mara lunged forward, nose high, then low, drawing in the smoke-tainted air. Elias tied a cloth over his mouth and followed her along the side of the greenhouse. Heat pressed through the cold. Glass cracked above them like winter bones. At the rear hatch, a charred beam had collapsed across the opening. From below came June's voice, faint but steady. "I'm fine," she called, which meant she was not. Clay backed his truck closer, chained the beam with hands that moved faster than his age should have allowed. "Tell me when." Elias crouched near the hatch. "June, stay low." "I am low, Rowan. It's a cellar." Despite the smoke, despite everything, Elias almost smiled. Mara barked toward a gap near the left side of the hatch, then pawed at the snow, showing where air still moved. "She's found a pocket," Elias said. Clay revved the truck. The chain snapped tight. The beam shifted once, stuck, then groaned free just enough to open a narrow passage. Elias went down on his stomach and reached through. June's hand found his. He pulled. Clay braced him by the belt. Mara barked once, then backed away as June emerged coughing, clutching a sealed evidence bag against her chest like an absurd treasure from a dragon's cave. "You went back for paper?" Elias said. June rolled onto the snow, breathing hard. "Technically, water samples and a ledger page." Lydia dropped beside her. "You are the worst patient I know." "I learned from veterinarians." The first fire truck siren finally echoed through the trees. As firefighters moved in, the small group stood back on the access road. The greenhouse had not burned completely. Snow, quick response, and poor fuel had saved part of it. But one wall was blackened. Several panes had burst. Smoke stained the morning white world into gray. People began arriving, at first only a few, then more. Trucks and sedans parked along the road. Men and women in winter coats stood silent, watching the old greenhouse breathe smoke into the sky. Someone whispered, "They tried to burn it." This time, no one corrected them. No one said accident. No one said rumor. No one said development. By dawn, the fire was out. Ruth Calder placed a cardboard box on the bakery counter before the first tray of rolls came from the oven. She wrote on it with a black marker, "Rebuild the greenhouse. Return the water to Brightwater." The first donation was coins. The second was a $20 bill folded twice. The third was an old wedding ring, dropped by a woman who left before Ruth could ask her name. By noon, there were signatures too. Not enough. Not yet. But names began appearing where silence had lived. Elias stood outside the bakery with Mara at his side and watched people come and go. Pip, wrapped in the red-brown scarf Ruth had given him, slept in June's arms like a tiny monarch exhausted by public duty. Clay emerged from the bakery carrying a roll he pretended he had not been given for free. "You know," he said, staring down Main Street, "my father would have hated all this fuss." Elias looked at him. Clay took a bite. He'd have shown up anyway. Across the street, the frozen lake gleamed in the winter sun. The town still looked beautiful. But now the beauty seemed less like a mask and more like something wounded trying to heal honestly. Mara leaned against Elias's leg, not from fear, from presence. One by one, Brightwater's people stepped toward Ruth's box, toward Lydia's notebook, toward Otis's legal pad. Not as heroes, as neighbors who had finally grown tired of watching smoke rise from the places where their courage should have been. And under the snow, somewhere beneath ash and broken glass, the old seeds waited. They had waited this long. They could wait a little longer, but not forever. Snow fell cleanly on the morning of the hearing. Not hard, not angry. It came down in quiet white layers, softening rooftops, fence rails, truck beds, and the stone steps of Brightwater's town hall. The frozen lake beyond Main Street caught the pale sun and threw it back in silver sheets, so bright that people arriving for the hearing had to narrow their eyes as they crossed the square. For years, Brightwater had looked beautiful from a distance. That morning, for the first time, Elias wondered if Beauty could be asked to tell the truth. He stood outside the council building with Mara at his left side. Her paracord collar was dark green against her black and tan fur. Her torn left ear twitched whenever a truck door closed too sharply. Pip was bundled in June's arms, wearing the little red-brown scarf Ruth had given him, looking less like a witness to civic corruption and more like a sleepy loaf of bread with paws. Clay Morrow stared at him. "That dog has better public relations than all of us." Pip yawned. Ruth Calder, carrying a basket of rolls under one arm, said, "That's because Pip has never lied on a water transfer form." Clay grunted. "Give him time. He looks ambitious." Elias almost smiled. Almost. The humor helped. It did not erase the weight of the morning, but it kept the weight from pretending to be the only thing in the world. Inside, the council chamber had already filled. Farmers, shop owners, retirees, mechanics, clerks, widows, men who had once looked away from Elias on the sidewalk, women who had lowered their voices in the bakery. All of them sat beneath fluorescent lights and old framed photographs of Brightwater's founders. Some had come out of conviction, some out of curiosity. Some, perhaps, because fear had finally become more exhausting than truth. Mayor Preston Crow stood near the front, speaking quietly with two attorneys in dark suits. He looked perfect. That was what struck Elias most. No panic, no visible anger. His silver hair was combed back, his charcoal suit unwrinkled, his pale scarf folded over one arm. He greeted people with small nods and a sympathetic smile, as if he had come to comfort the town through a misunderstanding rather than answer for one. When his eyes met Elias's, the smile did not change. That was the kind of man he was, a man whose face had learned to stay civilized while his hands moved other people's futures around on paper. Sheriff Dale Mercer stood near the side wall in full uniform. His badge had been polished, his gray mustache was trimmed, but he looked older than he had a week earlier. He kept touching the old Zippo lighter in his pocket, opening and closing the lid without taking it out. Lydia Voss sat at the front table with her red notebook, recorder, labeled folders, and the calm expression of a woman who had built a bridge out of facts and now intended to make everyone walk across it. Otis Bell sat beside her, thin hands folded over his cane. Nadine Weller sat behind them in a dark blue coat, the sunflower tin resting in her lap like a small battered ark. June stood near Elias with Pip tucked against her chest. Mara stayed close, not lunging, not hiding, just present. A mother who had crossed snow and somehow become a question no one could politely ignore. The hearing began with procedure. Procedure was slow, dry, and necessary. A county water examiner named Elaine Porter had been called in to observe after Lydia's report, and the greenhouse fire drew attention beyond Brightwater. She was a square-shouldered woman in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair cut at her jaw and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She did not seem impressed by anyone, which made Elias trust her a little. "This is not a criminal trial," she said at the beginning. "This is a public evidentiary hearing regarding emergency suspension of disputed water right transfers associated with the former Brightwater Seed Circle." Crow's attorney stood. "We object to the word disputed being used before any finding." Porter looked over her glasses. "Your objection is noted and not interesting." Ruth from the second row whispered, "I like her." The first hour belonged to paper. Maps were entered, bylaws were entered, copies of old ledgers, water schedules, cooperative records, and the suspicious transfer documents were placed one by one into the public record. Lydia presented dates, names, inconsistencies, and signatures from people who had already been dead when the documents claimed they had consented. Crow remained still. Not innocent. Still. Practiced still. Then Lydia played the recording from the greenhouse. Garrick's voice filled the chamber, rough and ugly, threatening enough that several people shifted in their seats. The clean-booted men were heard, too, one ordering Lydia not to record. Elias's own voice followed, low and controlled. Mara growled once from beneath the table in the recording, and in the room the real Mara lifted her head. People looked at her. This time, fewer looked away. June testified next. She did not dramatize. She did not beg. She described Mara's injuries, the signs of confinement, the old collar wounds, the malnutrition, the fresh shoulder trauma. She explained why Mara's reaction to Garrick was consistent with an animal responding to a source of prior harm. Crow's attorney tried to interrupt. Dr. Harlan is not qualified to speculate on the legal ownership. I am not speculating on ownership, June said. I am testifying that the animal suffered prolonged abuse. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The room heard her. Then Otis Bell stood. It took him a moment. Elias saw the old man's knee resist him, then his pride overpower the knee. Otis explained the safeguard clause. He spoke of the seed circle not as a romantic myth, but as a legal entity built by people who expected greed to outlive them and had tried, in their practical way, to fence it in. He described the requirement: at least 3 founding family representatives or successors requesting an emergency freeze if fraud was suspected. Clay Morrow stood after him. He carried the folder with his father's name. For once he had washed the machine oil from his hands, though the stains remained in the lines of his skin. His voice began rough, almost hostile, as if embarrassment had to leave his body before grief could speak. "My father didn't sign that paper," he said. "He couldn't. He was already buried by then." He held up the false transfer. A murmur moved through the chamber. Clay looked toward Crow, but not with rage. Something heavier. "All these years, I thought he lost the farm because he was stubborn and tired. Turns out he may have been right, and I was the one too tired to listen." That landed harder than accusation. Nadine came next. At first, she could not make her hands stop shaking. The sunflower tin sat open on the table. Inside were papers she had hidden so long they seemed to have absorbed her silence. Lydia gently placed one document before her. Otis nodded once. Nadine looked out at the room. "I was the bookkeeper," she said. "I made copies because numbers have a way of telling the truth after people stop doing it." A few people laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because they needed permission to breathe. She described the threats, the men at night, the warning that old houses could burn. She admitted she had been afraid. She did not decorate the confession. That made it stronger. Then she looked at Mara. "I fed that dog at the greenhouse," Nadine said. "Not enough. Never enough. I told myself a scrap of food was courage. It wasn't. It was only a scrap of food." Mara's torn ear tilted. Nadine wiped her eyes. But she kept coming back to the one place in this town where something had once been shared instead of stolen. Maybe that says more about us than about her. The room went very still. That was the moment Elias felt the hearing change, not in a legal way. Porter's face remained unreadable. Crow's smile stayed in place. The attorneys kept their notes, but around Elias, shoulders lowered, eyes lifted. People who had been spectators remembered they had names in old ledgers, too. They remembered wells, fields, fathers, mothers, signatures, silence. The truth had stopped being Lydia's report. It had become a mirror. Sheriff Dale Mercer rose before anyone called him. The room turned. Dale removed his hat. His face had gone pale under the winter red of his cheeks. "I received prior complaints," he said, "about threats, about Garrick Vale, about people being pressured over property and water claims." Crow's smile thinned. Dale swallowed. His hand moved toward his pocket, searching for the Zippo, then stopped. "I treated them as civil disputes when I should have investigated. I let political pressure influence my judgment." No one spoke. Dale looked at June, then Elias, then the floor. "I was afraid of making trouble," he said. "So I helped trouble feel safe." For a sheriff, it was a terrible confession. For a man, it was perhaps the first honest thing he had said in years. Garrick Vale was brought in later that afternoon under county custody, after officers outside Brightwater had detained him in connection with the greenhouse fire. He looked smaller without his truck, smaller without the keys at his belt, clattering like a warning bell. His face was gray, his eyes bloodshot, his anger drained by the realization that powerful men often used dirty hands and then washed their own. He did not become noble. He did not repent like a man in a sermon, but when asked whether he had been paid to discourage certain property owners from challenging transfers, he looked at Crow, then at Crow's attorneys, and saw no rescue coming. So he talked. Not everything. Enough. He admitted to watching the greenhouse access road, admitted to threatening people, admitted to being told to destroy remaining materials after the reporter and the soldier found the cellar. He claimed he did not know June had gone back inside. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just the one line of innocence he could still afford. By sunset, Elaine Porter announced her recommendation: emergency suspension of disputed water right transfers, immediate freeze pending county and federal review, preservation order for all Brightwater Seed Circle records, temporary halt of Crown Basin Development's resort approval process, a separate criminal investigation into the greenhouse fire, intimidation, document tampering, and animal abuse. The room did not erupt. Real justice did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came as a woman in reading glasses, stacking papers and saying, "Pending review," while a town exhaled for the first time in decades. Crow did not collapse. He did not shout. He only removed his glasses, folded them, and stared at the table as though the table had betrayed him. His resignation would come 2 days later, written in polished language about avoiding distraction during an investigation. Even defeat for men like Crow tried to wear a clean shirt. 3 weeks later, the greenhouse smelled of wet wood, warm bread, and thawing earth. The fire-scarred wall had been braced. The broken panes were stacked for removal. Clay had coaxed an old pump into coughing water through a temporary line, then called it a miracle performed by a machine too stupid to die. Ruth arrived with cinnamon rolls and coffee in dented thermoses. Lydia took photographs, not for exposure this time, but for record. June checked Mara's shoulder and declared her stubbornly alive, which Mara accepted with royal indifference. Pip charged through a shallow drift of snow near the planting beds, wearing his red-brown scarf and dragging one of Elias's gloves in his mouth. He tripped, recovered, shook the glove like a conquered beast, and barked at it with such seriousness that even Otis laughed. Elias stood near the open cellar hatch, now repaired and marked properly. The town had voted to restore Brightwater Seed Circle as a community trust. Not perfect, not finished, but real. Otis had agreed to advise. Lydia would document the process. Clay would oversee pumps. Nadine had offered the old records. Ruth had placed another box in the bakery, this one labeled Seed Money, because she said subtlety was overrated. And Elias had been asked to serve as temporary grounds manager for the greenhouse and seed cellar. At first, he had refused. Then Mara had looked at him in that quiet, unbearable way of hers, as if asking whether a man who had carried her out of snow truly intended to leave the door open and walk away. So he accepted. Not because he wanted to lead, because he finally understood that rescue was not a single act. It was maintenance. It was showing up after the dramatic part ended. It was fixing the hinge, clearing the path, checking the water line, keeping the place warm enough for fragile things to survive. Mara stood beside him now, stronger than she had been, her black and tan coat clean, the white lightning mark on her chest visible in the winter sun. She watched Pip terrorize the glove, then looked toward the greenhouse frame where townspeople lifted new panes into place. Elias rested a hand lightly on her head. This time she did not merely allow it. She leaned in. The lake beyond town shone beneath a sky scrubbed bright by snow. The mountains stood ancient and patient. Brightwater was not healed. Not entirely. A town, like a man, did not become whole because one lie was exposed. But beneath the repaired tables in trays of dark soil, The first seeds had been planted. Small things, ordinary things, things that looked like nothing until time and care proved otherwise. Elias touched the brass compass in his pocket and found he did not need to open it. For once he knew where he was. Mara pressed against his leg. Pip barked triumphantly at the defeated glove. Ruth laughed. Clay swore at the pump. Lydia captured the moment. June pretended not to smile. And in Brightwater, winter no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a blank white page waiting for the first green line to rise. Sometimes courage does not begin with a shout. It begins with a quiet choice to open the door, to protect the wounded, to speak when silence feels safer. Elias did not save Brightwater alone. Mara did not carry a miracle in her teeth. But together they reminded a frightened town that God can use the smallest acts of mercy to uncover what has been buried too long. So today may we notice the wounded, defend what is right, and remember that even under the coldest snow, hope can still be waiting for someone brave enough to tend it. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about a time when a small act of kindness changed something in your life. And if you enjoy stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe and join us for the next one. May God bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and enough light for the next step.